Chapter 100. A Seat at the Round Table.
In the first 3 minutes that I knew him, Eduardo Prado reminded me of James Bond, of Rick Dees, and of John F. Kennedy. But it was only after seeing Eduardo interact with Guatemala's poorest people that the fourth and final image of him peeked over the horizon of my mind. This fleeting glimpse happened on the sidewalk outside the hotel where Eduardo and I had met by accident only a few minutes earlier. After pausing to introduce me to a young Guatemalan boy, perhaps 14 years old and obviously quite poor, Eduardo stared deeply into the young man's eyes, placed his fingers on the boy's cheek, and spoke to him very fervently and quietly in Spanish. When Eduardo was finished, the boy smiled softly and nodded confidently. Eduardo then patted the boy's cheek, and they parted. In that singularly tender and majestic moment, I was reminded not so much of John F. Kennedy as of England's fabled King Arthur. "What did you say to him?" I asked. Eduardo said, "I told him that he was an extremely smart young man and that he had a very bright future and that he should never quit believing in it." After a moment of silence, Eduardo continued, "He is a student in a class that I teach." "What kind of class?" I asked. Eduardo looked at me thoughtfully and said, "Are you familiar with the saying, 'Give a man a fish and he eats for a day, teach him to fish and he eats for a lifetime'?" I nodded that I was. Eduardo then smiled a bittersweet smile and said, "I teach the poor how to escape their poverty." Glancing at his watch, he said he had to leave for an important meeting, but that he and Anna would try to catch up with us later on. I walked back into the lobby of the hotel to meet Penny, Guillermo, Sergio, and Juan Manuel for a tour of the fabulous 450-year-old mountain city of Antigua, Guatemala. The first place we went was the palace. As we turned a corner and stepped into a large room, a crowd of people immediately rose from their seats and turned toward us. Embarrassed, I wondered what we had interrupted. Taking me by the arm, Sergio Garcia led me to the front of the room and motioned that I should sit in an ancient wooden chair. As I did, a pair of elegant gentlemen swept in from doorways on either side of the room to stand at each end of the table opposite me. Then, from behind a curtain at the front of the room, an immaculately dressed gentleman emerged wearing a very large medallion around his neck. Our eyes met in an electric moment of stunned surprise. The man was Eduardo Prado. Recovering from his shock, Eduardo began speaking to me in Spanish, as Sergio Garcia interpreted. "It is good to see you again, my friend. I apologize that now I must speak to you in Spanish only, but the law requires that all official functions be conducted in the Spanish language." After several more minutes of regal formalities, Sergio translated, "As Comendador of Antigua, it is my honor to knight you as counselor to the Comendador. The appointment is for life. You will henceforth be known as the Don Roy H. Williams." As he placed the large engraved medallion over my head, Eduardo whispered, "In English, this makes you Sir Roy H. Williams. And by the way, why is there no picture of you in your books? I thought you would be much older." As we shook hands, I asked Eduardo what the responsibilities of the Comendador's counselor might be. "You are to help me think of ways to help this city and to care for its people. Will you do this?" I replied that I would do so to the best of my ability. I then asked Eduardo whether knighting people was a thing he did often. He replied, "The title you now hold was created by the King of Spain many years ago, and was given to a few of the Spanish conquistadors. But you, my friend, are the first knight of Antigua in nearly 200 years." Obviously, Eduardo Prado was hoping that by giving me a knighthood, it would cause the Guatemalan people to become very dear to me, and that I would do my best to think of ways to help him help them. He was right. I will do what I can to help, but my motive isn't tied to any appreciation of the knighthood, although I do enjoy the thought of signing my name Sir Roy once in a while. I plan to help Eduardo Prado, because I once saw him lay his hand on the cheek of a poor Guatemalan boy and promise that boy a bright future. I just want to make sure Eduardo can keep that promise.
Roy Williams and his students from Wizard Academy have decided to provide personal assistance to the people of Guatemala. Therefore, all royalties from their book, Accidental Magic, will be donated to this struggling country. What is accidental magic? Inspired by the techniques taught at Wizard Academy, students have created literary snapshots from the Academy's amateur photography collection. The students, made up of business professionals from some of the world's most successful corporations, are mastering techniques required to imprint vivid mental imagery. So the magic in the photographs is accidental, but the magic in the words, intentional. Which snapshot do you suppose will be more interesting?
Chapter 100 plus 1. Dr. Seuss on Writing for Children.
There are many reasons why an intelligent man should never, ever write for children. Of all professions for a man, it is socially the most awkward. You go to a party, and how do they introduce you? The hostess says, Dr. Seuss. Meet Henry J. Bronkman. Mr. Bronkman manufactures automobiles, jet planes, battleships, and bridges. Dr. Seuss, well, he writes the sweetest, dear, darlingest little whimsies for wee kiddies. Mr. Bronkman usually tries to be polite. He admits there is a place in the world for such activities. He admits he once was a kiddie himself. He even confesses to having read Peter Rabbit. Then, abruptly, he excuses himself and walks away in search of more vital and rugged companionship. Wherever a juvenile writer goes, he is constantly subjected to humiliating indignities. When asked to take part in a panel discussion along with the other members of the writing fraternity, he's given the very end seat at the table, always one seat lower than the dusty anthologist who compiled The Unpublished Letters of Dribble Sneth, Second Assistant Secretary or something or other under Polk. Besides that, since we don't make much money, our friends are always getting us aside and telling us, look now, you can do better. After all, with all your education, there must be some way you could crack the adult field. The thing that's so hard to explain to our friends is that most of us who specialize in writing humor for children have cracked the adult field, and having cracked it, have decided definitely that we prefer to uncrack it. We are writing for the so-called brat field by choice. For despite the fact this brands us as pariahs, despite the fact that this turns us into literary untouchables, there is something we get when we write for the young that we never can hope to get in writing for you ancients. To be sure, in some ways you are superior to the young. You scream less. You burp less. You have fewer public tantrums. You ancients are, generally speaking, slightly more refined. But when it comes to trying to amuse you, have you ever stopped to consider what has happened to your sense of humor? When you were a kid, named Willie or Mary, the one thing you did better than anything else was laugh. The one thing you got more fun out of than anything else was laughing. Why? I don't know. Maybe it has to do with juices. And when somebody knew how to stir those juices for you, you really rolled on the floor. Remember? Your sides almost really did split. Remember? You almost went crazy with the pain of having fun. You were a terrible blitz to your family. So what? Your juices were juicing. Your lava was seething. Your humor was spritzing. You really were living. At that age, you saw life through very clear windows. Small windows, of course, but very bright windows. And then, what happened? You know what happened. The grown-ups began to equip you with shutters. Your parents, your teachers, your everyone around you, your all of those people who loved and adored you. They decided your humor was crude and too primitive. You were laughing too loud, too often, and too happily. It was time you learned to laugh with a little more restraint. They began pointing out to you that most of this wonderful, giddy nonsense that you laughed at wasn't, after all, quite as funny as you thought. Now, why, they asked, are you laughing at that? It's completely pointless and utterly ridiculous. Nonsense, they told you, is all right in its place. But it's time you learned how to keep it in its place. There's much more in this world than just nonsense. Your imagination, they told you, was getting a bit out of hand. Your young, unfettered mind, they told you, was taking you on too many wild flights of fancy. It was time your imagination got its feet down on the ground. It was time your version of humor was given a practical, realistic base. They began to teach you their versions of humor, and the process of destroying your spontaneous laughter was underway. A strange thing called conditioned laughter began to take its place. Now, conditioned laughter doesn't spring from the juices. It doesn't even spring. Conditioned laughter germinates, like toadstools on a stump. And unless you were a very lucky little Willie or Mary, you soon began to laugh at some very odd things. Your laughs, unfortunately, began to get mixed with sneers and smirks. This conditioned laughter the grown-ups taught you depended entirely on their conditions. Financial conditions, political conditions, racial, religious, and social conditions. You began to laugh at people your family feared or despised, people they felt inferior to, or people they felt better than. If your father said a man named Herbert Hoover was an ass, and asses should be laughed at, you laughed at Herbert Hoover. Or if you were born across the street, you laughed at Franklin Roosevelt. Who they were, you didn't know, but the local ground rules said you were to laugh at them. In the same way, you were supposed to guffaw when somebody told a story which proved that Swedes are stupid, Scots are tight, Englishmen are stuffy, and the Mexicans never wash. Your laughs were beginning to sound a little tinny. Then you learned it was socially advantageous to laugh at Protestants and or Catholics. You readily learned, according to your conditions, that you could become the bright boy of the party by harpooning a hook into Jews, or Christians, labor, or capital, or the Tun Verein, or the Strawberry Festival. You still laughed for fun, but the fun was getting hammed in by a world of regulations. You were laughing at subjects according to their listing in the ledger. Every year, as you grew older, the laughs that used to split your sides diminished. The ledger furnished more sophisticated humor. You discovered a new form of humor based on sex. Sex, a taboo subject, called for very specialized laughter. It was a subject that was never considered funny in large gatherings. It was a form of humor you never indulged in at Sunday school. It was a form of humor that was subtle and smart, and you learned to restrict it and reserve it for special friends. And by the time you had added that accomplishment to your repertoire, you know what had happened to you, Willie or Mary? Your capacity for healthy, silly, friendly laughter was smothered. You'd really grown up. You'd become adults, which is a word that means obsolete children. As adults, before you laugh, you ask yourselves questions. Do I dare laugh at that in the presence of the boss? Sort of dangerous when you consider how he feels about Taft-Hartley. How loud shall I laugh at that one? Miss Cuthbertson, my hostess, is laughing only 15 decibels. Shall I come right out and say I thought the book was funny? The reviewer in the Times said the humor was downright silly. These are the questions that children never ask. The Times reviewer and Mrs. Cuthbertson to the contrary notwithstanding. Children never let their laughs out on a string. On their laughter, there is no political or social pressure gauge. That, I think, is why we maverick humorists prefer to write exclusively for children. And that wraps up the book, Magical Worlds of the Wizard of Ads. There is a photocopy on the final page of a note that was laid on the lectern during the lunch break whenever I was speaking at the Toronto Convention Center recently. It was from a fellow named Stephen Casey, art director of a thing called the Brainstorm Group. After listening to me speak for 3 hours, he left a note that said, "When bebafflers abound you, can they learn to sing?" Well, the answer is yes, Stephen. If they really want to, they can learn to sing.